Luxembourg, and he was the first person ever to fly a plane across the Atlantic Ocean, which doesn't seem like that big a deal to us until you think about who was the first person ever to be in New York on one day and in Paris on the next. 40 years later, Charles Lindbergh was at a banquet where he got to meet a man named Neil Armstrong. Pretty cool. Do you think that Charles Lindbergh flying that tin-can airplane over the Atlantic could ever have imagined that he would live to see the first man to walk on the moon? And now, even today, on my bedside table is a National Geographic magazine that's talking about expeditions to Mars. That could happen maybe not in my lifetime, but in my daughter's lifetime. Could you imagine that? And yet, faith, it seems to me, is all about that kind of imagination. Faith is a testing of our imagination. Think about Peter in this gospel lesson today. Peter, who'd spent his whole life in a small Galilean town. Peter, who'd been a fisherman. Peter, who had never known anything except what he had learned, which is that we worship God in the temple in Jerusalem. And that's where God is, and that's where we go to pray and offer sacrifices to God. And then Peter meets a man named Jesus who says, you know, God can be just as present at a wedding in Cana of Galilee, or just as present at a dinner table with 12 friends as he is in Jerusalem. In fact, God can be just as present with his friends cooking fish on the beach as he can be in the temple of Jerusalem. In fact, that's where Jesus chooses to show up after the resurrection, not in the temple. In fact, Jesus can be just as present, can we imagine that, in a coffee shop as he can be in our grand cathedrals. My friend Mark Lagori talks about faith as being like bungee jumping. And when I told that to my friend Kelley, she said, no, it's about like cliff diving, because God doesn't even keep a bungee cord. And I wonder if that's sort of what Jesus is saying to Peter here. Peter, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than all of this? Do you love me more than Galilee? Do you love me more than your fishing boats? Do you love me more than your job? More than your family? More than your traditions? More than your places? More than your temple? Do you love me more than that? Because that's what you're going to need to do to be able to take that leap off the cliff. You're going to need to love me most of all. That's what you're going to need to be able to do, is to set all that aside and follow me in order to feed my lambs, in order to preach this gospel to the ends of the earth. I don't think Peter would have been able to imagine the Abbey, but I don't think he would have been shocked by it. And that's what takes us to our friend Paul. To Paul, who went places and did things and preached things that I think not even Peter would have been able to imagine that day on the beach.
It's Paul that shows up in Athens after he's been run out of 2 other towns. Not necessarily the most successful evangelist that we could have really asked for. So he gets to Athens, and he is in the temple babbling there about Jesus, and they drag him to the court at Mars Hill. Paul gives us very important lessons about what it might mean to be an evangelist in a world that is not quite sure about you. Going to the court at Mars Hill was not a good thing. Socrates did not have a good fate there several hundred years before that, and was actually sentenced to die for preaching a new divinity in Athens. And so Paul is there, and he's called on to make this speech, and we learn very important things about this speech. Number 1, when in Athens, you should speak Greek. This is not a passage filled with references to the Psalms or to the prophets. It is a passage that calls on the poetry and philosophy of Greece. You should also not panic. Paul could have certainly cut and run from that court, but he stood firm, and he stood firm because he was rooted in that love of Jesus that pulled him out into the world. And he paid attention and noticed that even in Athens there was an altar to an unknown God. And that's what he spoke to the Athenians about. Evangelism isn't showing up with a Bible and hitting somebody over the head with it. Evangelism is showing up and having a conversation, not to win it, but just for the conversation itself. That's what Paul did in Athens. He didn't win a lot of souls there either, but he had some folks say, I will hear from you again about this. One of the most important things that we learn from Paul is no matter what, we are people of the gospel. He didn't stick with the philosophers and the poets. At the end of the day, he preached the message of the love of Jesus Christ, his death, crucifixion, and his resurrection, and the life that could be offered through that. Today, we come here, we bless this space, we'll have a coffee shop, we hope to have a whole bunch more worship services. It's a little risky, we're a little scared, but we're going to have a good time doing it, and we hope even in this big room you're having fun, and we'll have fun later. But the very important thing to remember is God didn't show up here because we decided to open the Abbey. Just like God didn't show up in Athens when Paul showed up that day. God has always been here. Our job is to follow him. Amen.